where those standards are and what they say. What do I need to do to get approval for a simulation training program? This is where the meat and potatoes are. If you decide to go down this road, what are the sorts of things that you're going to have to do to get flag state acceptance? And then finally, which I think is the most exciting part, this is the emerging trend, is can I blend simulation with e-learning for delivery of training in remote locations? I think this is, over the past few months, this has been the #1 issue in the industry to see how they can do that. So I'm going to talk not so much about the technical side of how you can do that, because of course you can do this technically, but I'm going to speak from the regulatory point of view, is what are you allowed to do and what are some of the trends that we're seeing in the regulators. So is simulation authorized? In general, if you want to use simulation to augment the lecture portion of your courses, you're free to do so. Where the sticky point comes in is if you want to use simulation to assess the competence of a person, that's when the regulations kick in. And the way that the marine regulations are set up, it's if it's not specifically allowed, then it is prohibited. That's the general rule of thumb. And where that comes from is section A14 of the STCW convention. I've taken a snippet from the book that I have here at my elbow. And the key part in this is the section 5 under control procedures. Blow it up so you can actually read it. And it says, when you're assessing competence, only the methods for demonstrating competence that are provided in the competence tables in the code are allowed to be used. So you're not allowed to, let's say if you have a competence that you want to assess using a simulator, the table does not allow it, it doesn't specifically say you can use a simulator, then in general, it's not allowed. Now there's an exception to that, and I'll get to that exception in a moment. So I'll give you, for example, some of you may not have seen the competence tables in STCW. There's the one for lifeboats. It's got 4 columns. The first column is the competence that has to be achieved. The second column is the knowledge, understanding, and proficiency that you have to be able to demonstrate in order to say that you've achieved that competence. In the IMO circles and with flag states, you keep hearing them talk about the KUPs, and that's column 2 is the KUPs. Column 3 is where it's said what methods are allowed to be used to assess competence. And so it says methods of demonstrating competence. And in that column, that's where it has to say that you can use a simulator if you're allowed to use it. So the piece at the bottom that's highlighted in yellow, I blew that so you can see that they have, the assessment, competence assessed by assessing evidence obtained from a practical demonstration of the ability to, and has a bunch of things, using inflatable life raft and an open or enclosed lifeboat with inboard engine, or approved simulator training when appropriate. So when you have that phrase, approved simulator training where appropriate, when that's contained in a competency table in column 3, that means that IMO has said that simulation is suitable for use to assess the particular competence that's in that table. So why do they do that? They're not a blanket authorization. And, there's been some really important lessons learned with simulation across defense, aviation, maritime, is that it's probably the most powerful tool we have in our arsenal for doing practical training. Is you can definitely teach people how to do something using a simulator. The problem is, if your simulator does not match reality close enough, is the thing that you've learned in the simulator you cannot use in the real world. So that's why there's a restriction on the use of simulation, is that the international community has to know that the simulation technology and the techniques are up to the standard where you could actually learn something positive from the use of the simulator. If it was just left wide open, you end up with a lot of simulators proliferating into the industry, Some of them would be validated, many of them would not, and you would not be certain whether the things that you learn from simulation could be applied in the real world. That's why the international community has got this restriction, is that if it's not allowed, it's prohibited. So what happens in the case have STCW convention is revised roughly every 15 years. It might be, might go to 20 years in some cases. So in that time, there is an enormous amount of innovation that happens. New simulators, new training techniques, all kinds of things happen within that 15-year period. And, the industry is not efficient for them to prohibit the use of new technology for that entire period until it gets written into the next version of the convention. So Regulation 113 of the convention says that a flag state, if they want to try something new, they are allowed to do it. So they're allowed to do trials, and they can test something out. And what they're looking for the trials is to see if they're giving the same degree of safety, security, and pollution prevention as would be provided by doing something in the way that's currently permitted. So we'll go back to the lifeboat example. It's one that we're very familiar with. In the past, you had to demonstrate that you could launch a lifeboat with lifeboats and davits. That's what was in the convention. So somebody had to do a trial somewhere and prove that you could actually learn how to do this task correctly using simulators. And once that trial is done, is that many flag states then will accept the results from the trial and will approve the use of simulation within the context of what was found in the trial. And then at the next rewrite of the convention, then there would be an addition to the competence table to make that clear. Now, sometimes you can do that in advance if that particular topic item is open, like a polar code, for instance. But for some things that are more routine, you wait until the rewrite. So what do one of these trial reports look like? And it looks like it's trying to load what the next one is. I don't know, Allison, are you seeing it on your side?
I am seeing that. So I'm just going to try and go back in here for you.
Okay. Allison will bring that back. But basically what I was going to show you was the trial report from Transport Canada. And before lifeboat simulation, for instance, was approved, is that there was an enormous amount of testing done by Transport Canada as a flag state to make sure that there was a positive learning transfer, that what you learned in the simulator, you could actually apply in real life. And they came up with an audit report. The audit report is actually being accepted by many flag states as evidence that you're allowed to use simulation for assessing of competencies that are outside of what's in the KUP. Now, there are some exceptions to this. It's not on the maritime side, but it's in the oil and gas side. Is that the oil and gas side, we're starting to see some regulators like the the Training and Qualifications Committee that regulates offshore training in Newfoundland. They also have a large body of competencies that are covered under their training standards, and they too also had in their minimum equipment requirements. But as simulation was coming on stream and the oil and gas industry was adopting it, they didn't want to have to go back in and amend each individual competency to say that you could use a simulator. So they put a blanket requirement up at the front end. So they say that you can use a simulator as long as you can prove that, number one, it meets the STCW performance standards, and number two, you can prove that it's actually effective in delivering the training. And once you can prove that, then you can use simulation for whatever purpose you want within their training standards. There was a move at IMO in the Manila amendments to implement a similar provision. India, I think, had put that one forward. It was rejected at that time, but who knows? I think when we get into the next revision of the convention, 2025 timeframe, that you might see something like this reappear in the STCW. So we'll move on now. Is that that gives you an idea of if you want to use simulation for a particular application, your first place you got to look is the convention itself to see if simulation is allowed. If it is allowed, then you say, well, how do I know if I have a simulator that meets the requirements that are in the convention? Be, because there are specific things that you have to be the simulator has to be able to do that's actually hardwired into the convention, and the regulation that deals with that is regulation 112, the use of simulators. And what it says there, if you are going to use a simulator for any of the mandatory simulation based training, is radar and ARPA, or if you're going to voluntarily use simulation, as the option for, delivering certain competencies, if you're using it for that purpose, or if you're going to use simulation as part of refresher training, which is, a means of demonstrating continued proficiency, that the simulator, in all those contexts, the simulator has to meet a minimum performance standard that's set by IMO. So you can't say, well, this is not, I'm using it, but it's kind of, a specialty use, even though it's provided by the convention. My simulator does not have to conform with any performance standards. That's not true. If you are going to be assessing the competence of any seafarer using a simulator, that simulator has to conform with minimum performance standards. So where do you find them? Well, that's in section A112, standards governing the use of simulators. There's two parts. I'm going to talk about part one right now, and then part two will follow shortly. It's about how you structure your program. But in part one, it says that the simulators used in training or in assessment, there's a parallel provision to this. It has to be suitable for the training tasks. And there's three main things it has to be able to do out of this one. It has to have sufficient behavioral realism to allow the trainee to learn something. When they say behavior, they mean like the math models. It has to have a controlled environment that the instructor can give a bunch of different conditions, and the physical environment has to emulate what you would find on the ship. Now there are a few other things which you can read later on, but those three things are the key ones: is emulating the real world, behavioral realism, and controlled environment. So how do you know if your simulator meets that requirement? Now, in the old days, each flag state used to have their own standards. Transport Canada used to have one. But that started to lead with a whole bunch of variations in interpretation amongst different flag states. And from a manufacturer's point of view, it's almost impossible then to build a simulator that met everyone's standards. So it was around the year 2000, and actually based on work that IMSF had done, is that the class societies took up the mantle of doing the certification for simulators. So there are two that are currently doing it. One is DNVGL, and the other one is Class NK. They both have standards for certifications of maritime simulator systems, and their standards essentially is a method that they use to verify that a simulator meets the minimum performance standards, required at IMO. So the way that you would know, I'll go to the next slide. I'm not sure if our slides are.
So what I'm doing, Tony, excuse me for one moment. For some reason, the document will not load, so I'm sharing my screen with your presentation. So just let me know when you want to move along, so I can move along to the next slide here.
There we go.
Perfect.
Okay. So this one here is when you look in the tables, what it has is on the left-hand side for a particular simulator, it says what competency have they assessed the simulation technology against, and that's, you can see in this example here at the table A62-1.1, competence, take charge of a boat. They said, okay, for that competence, what is the minimum performance specification for a simulator to meet that? And then you can see there, they say an A, B, or C simulator or Class S can meet that. And they just break down all of the things that they've tested. So if you are doing, you want to get a simulator that's going to be used for a particular purpose, you look at what the STCW reference is you look on this table, and then you can see what class of simulator meets your need. There's a special column, that class S. The class S, as you can see on this table, actually, that there's probably more competencies that lifeboat operators would have to have than are on this table, but DNV-GL hasn't formally assessed them. That's really where class S comes in. So if you want to use a simulator, let's say for assessing competence during onboard drills, well, that's not one of the STCW competencies, but it's a valid application of the simulator. In that case, the manufacturer has to provide all the evidence that the simulator works in that context, and DNV-GL will provide them with a Class S designation. And that just means that when you're looking at using simulators for things outside of this table, is that the manufacturer has to have done their homework to prove that the simulator actually works in that context. And that's how you would satisfy the minimum performance standards from IMO. So next one. And just if you dig into it, there's the three things that they would look at. There's tables related to physical realism, behavioral realism, and operating environment. They put down the requirement, and they say if you're going to go for a Class A, B, or C designation, whether that particular thing has to be there. There's nothing on Class S, because Class S, the manufacturer provides their own matrix, and then DNV assesses against that. Okay, next one down. And at the end of the day, after you go through all that, a manufacturer would get this statement of compliance. And it just says that DNV-GL has, in this case, or Class NK, if it was Class NK, said that they have assessed the simulator and it meets the minimum performance requirements as outlined in STCW. So this is your first step of verification, is to make sure that the simulator, if you're going to use a simulator for assessing of competence under STCW and many offshore oil standards that have adopted STCW as kind of their simulation standard, is that the simulator must have one of these. That's the only way that you can validate that the simulator meets the performance requirements in the convention. So let's go down to the next piece. So we'll say that you do have a simulator, so now you want to create a training program. So how do you get approval for that? And that's where part 2 comes in of section A112. And the essence of this is that the training and assessment objectives need to be clearly stated. This is a little bit different than in standard marine training, that this goes over and above what you would normally do. You have to be very explicit on what are the objectives you're trying to get to. And that these training objectives have to be tagged to something that the person does in the workplace. So it implies that there's a job task analysis in the back of this to show that the thing that you're doing in the simulator actually maps to a job you do on the ship. There's enhanced briefing and debriefing requirements. It's very similar to practical training you would do in emergency training, but very different than what you would do in a classroom. The simulations themselves, the scenarios, have to be appropriate to the competence level that you're testing, and they have to be validated. This is probably the biggest weakness in simulation training, is the validation of the scenarios. It's very easy to make scenarios that are too hard or too easy. You got to find that Goldilocks zone that is appropriate to the students. And then finally, there's special training for simulator instructors and assessors. It's probably a bigger deal for lecturers than it would be for instructors who are teaching on the practical side, let's say boat training or safety training. Next. Okay, this is, I'm going to skip ahead. I'm kind of losing a little bit of time here, but this one here just shows what are the procedures if you're structuring assessments. The other one before the citation there was, if you're going to do training using a simulator, here's how you have to structure the training program. And this one is about if you're going to do an assessment using a simulator, here's how you have to structure the assessment program. We'll keep going down. Okay, and then this is the instructor training requirements. Is that basically instructors or assessors, if they're using simulators, they have to have special training in the training techniques using a simulator. Again, those techniques are very similar to the techniques used in hands-on emergency training. And they also have to have received training on how to operate the simulator that they're actually using. So this would be like manufacturer or vendor training. And it's the same thing for the assessment of competence. There are IMO model courses in behind this, but many countries have adopted their own local standards that they use for that. Next. And you talk about the scenario documentation. This is kind of the key things. After the STCW 95, the Europeans did a great job in figuring out how to conform with what was then new simulation standards. And this is just an example of a template that the Europeans came up with, which I see is commonly used. But it just goes down to, it's like every minute of this scenario needs to be documented, and you got to say explicitly what's happening throughout the training program. Next. And then finally, this is an example from our work on scenario validation. We've got to the point now where we understand the learning curves for every one of the tasks that are in our simulators, and we can do Monte Carlo simulations of what the failure rates would be for various simulations on various sequences. So this is our first cut at validation, and we make sure that we don't put things that are too hard or too easy in the program, and that there's a steady progression of difficulty from beginning to end. But all of these things are not just things over and above what's required. These are actually the requirements that are in part 2 of the convention, is an expectation that one way or the other, that the person using simulation for training and assessment is doing this in the background. And to give an example, a fully documented simulation course for accreditation can run over 100 pages long of information to meet the minimum STCW requirements. So next. And to be honest with you, that's probably the biggest workload. Buying the simulator is the easy part. Documenting and developing and documenting the training program is the hard part. So I'm going to get into the last piece now, which is probably the most exciting part, is blended learning. With the pandemic, everyone is cut off from traditional sources of training. People want to do training on board. Can you do that? Can you do a blend of e-learning and simulation? Can you use that for demonstration of continued proficiency? And can you use that for things for alternate compliance for high-risk activities that you'd be doing on board during drills, for instance? And what you see here in the picture is a concept that we're fielding, which is gaining traction, which is it's a mixed reality. So the eyes are in the virtual world, the hands are in the real world, and this whole simulation is coupled together with an e-learning package, and there are no instructors in this. The whole thing is self-learning. Okay, next, please. So what's the regulatory guidance and baseline for this? Because this is brand new. Transport Canada is only giving authorizations for this in the past 2 or 3 weeks. So the first one is Section B16 of the STCW convention. Section B is non-mandatory. It's a guidance section. Flag states can use it or not use it. In Canada, everything that's in Part B is mandatory for us. But it says if you're going to use distance learning and e-learning, here's the things that you have to implement. And if you take the time to go through this point by point, it's amazingly like structuring a simulation program. It's the same sort of thing. And remember I said, if you're going to be using simulation in lectures, usually you have free reign to do so. Well, incorporating simulation into an e-learning program is completely within the rules as far as doing a training program. Now, assessment of competence is a slightly different matter, but as far as delivering the training, there's your simulation is really an extension of this Section B. Next. But then when you start getting into specific applications, and I'm picking lifeboats again because this is probably where the most feverish activity right now is going on. is that in the offshore industry, there's been so many accidents. In fact, it's not just offshore, it's around the whole industry. So many accidents during life drills that the MODU code was changed. And the MODU code now allows an alternate compliance mechanism for doing onboard drills. And this is the alternate compliance mechanism. It's MSC 1 Cert 1486. And it says once every 2.5 years, if you do training at a facility approved by the administration, you can use that training in lieu of actually launching boats, like you personally being in the boat and launching during a drill. It doesn't mean that you don't muster and you don't launch boats at all, but you probably launch empty boats and you still do all your musters and equipment checks. But the actual process of lowering a boat into the water, driving away, doing a rescue, you can do that with this intermediate training. The interesting part about this is that this revision specifically states you're allowed to use simulation as part of that training program. And when you look at drills and exercises in that other resolution 1079, it specifically states in there that the only way to prepare people for launching into rough seas is a simulator. So what we have seen is that flag states have been making a few rulings. One is that the offshore platform itself can be a location at a facility satisfactory to the administration. That unit that I showed you with the VR and the integrated into the e-learning program is a program which meets a large portion of the intermediate training. So there's an example of how this blended learning being used in the worksite is starting to work with a blend of e-learning, simulation, and actually using equipment on board the rig. And they're being able to knock off the requirement to maintain competence in launching boats. Next one. That's on the MODU side, but here's 1570. I took a few snippets. This is from the seafarer side, from the ships. And again, there's been so many accidents with launching boats that, there's guidelines coming out all the time on how to make this safer. And the bottom line is that the drills are the emphasis is on learning. And these two sections say two things. One is they say, take the risk out of the learning process. In many places under ISM provisions, captains are just not putting people on board the boats while they're launching them anymore. And it's not just light boats, it's fast rescue craft as well. But the 1.4 talks about this concept, which is undefined at this point, of additional special drills can be used to augment the drill program. And we're starting to see, in the past months, we've started to see that the shipping side is adopting what has been done in the offshore side for the past 3 or 4 years in adopting these VR e-learning programs as an additional special drill to be done on board to augment their so that they can maintain their competence and take the risk out of it. So, and the question is, how far can you go? Well, actually, you can go quite far. Is that ABS as a class society? Remember, drills normally come under RO responsibilities. As an RO, they said that the training program that was created, in their opinion, meets the different circulars, as well as, in their opinion, meets the requirement for continuous proficiency under STCW. And at least one flag state, in fact, there's another couple that we're on the verges of getting, I just don't have the thing to put up here, is the Republic of Liberia said, okay, for people working on Liberian ships, if you're following this onboard training program with the simulation, e-learning, and the equipment that's on board the ship, and you show us the records that you've completed that training program, well, that counts as refresher. That's basically what that certification is. And I think this fundamentally changed and redefines what refresher training is. It gets rid of the idea that there actually is even refresher training. There is no training. You're maintaining your skills on board through regular practice. What is left over is that there's a regular verification of competence by an independent third party on shore. That's kind of where this is leading towards. And it's very exciting because I think it brings us back to the traditional way that we trained. It was more of an apprenticeship training, is that we would learn how to do our jobs by actually doing our jobs. And somebody on board the ship that was more senior than us would observe that and then would at some point say that we could do our jobs correctly or not. As a whole, the industry's kind of been drifting away from that. And I think that being able to bring this like VR and e-learning and that sort of thing back on board, you are returning back to the system that we used to have, but it's much safer, it's much more robust, and it's much easier to administer. So next, I think. And I think that's it. I've kind of gone over time a little bit, but there's a lot of unanswered questions here, of course, and that's like around the technologies and how do you know that the simulation actually works? What's the research that's gone on behind it to prove it? Those are topics for later webinars where we'll dig into those topics in a lot more detail. But this one here is really about the regulatory landscape, and to show that that there are pathways through the existing regulations that if you can prove that the simulation e-learning blend works, that you will be allowed to use it. Might take a little bit of effort, and in some cases we've already done that effort for you, but it does show that the path is there. And with that, I think I'm going to stop. And Alison, I don't know if there's any questions that you want to.
No, we don't have any so far. Thank you so much, Tony, and apologies for the technical difficulties in there, but hopefully you were able to follow along as I shared my screen. Yes, we will provide the webinar presentation from Tony after we're finished, but we can open the floor for any questions for Tony at the moment. And so we do have a few more attendees here, so welcome everyone. And there is a comment from Chris. Thanks, Chris, for joining us. It says, "It's excellent. I wish our Gulf of Mexico platforms had more contemporary regulatory framework and progressive-minded regulator." So Chris did have to jump off, but thank you for doing that. You are very welcome, Ale. And we can hold the floor for anyone for a couple of moments for any questions. Was there anything, Tony, that while we wait that you wanted to elaborate on? Well, we actually, what I will do is I will introduce that we are having. Hopefully that is coming up. We are having a webinar next week. It will be hosted by Robert Rumble, our Director of Operations. He will be talking about the hardware that is available to use to enhance your training in simulation. So he will go through what we have available, what is available to you to enhance your training programs through simulation. So I'll send out an invitation later, and hopefully the call to action is showing here on the screen. So Sandeep is curious, Tony, do we have any users in Singapore? Oh, I think you are muted somehow. Actually, Tony, can you hear me? We can't hear you, unfortunately.
There we go. Sorry,
oh,
check.
Okay, so you might have to start again from the question on Singapore. Okay.
Yeah. So we do not have any shore-based facilities in Singapore. We are deployed on an increasing number of floating assets in the offshore fleet that do come into Singapore waters, and that would be in Singapore, let's say for a refit, or that would be on standby. So you're probably more likely to encounter our systems as an onboard system at this point. But to make the whole concept work is, remember, it's practice on board and it's assessment of competence on shore. And ultimately, we will need assessment centers in Singapore so that the people who are doing the training on board can come ashore and do an independent verification of assessment.
Great, thank you, Tony. So the next question is from Steve. Hi, Steve and Emmanuel. Are you going to do any demonstrations so we can see how the system works? So that is going to be covered in our webinar next week. It's the same time. I will send out an invitation following this. And I have created a call to action. Hopefully it is showing up here on the top of the screen. Let me just double check that. Okay, it should be there. And so we invite you to attend next week. So Robert is going to walk us through that. So, and then we can always do that at a separate time if next week doesn't work.
There's a question there about MPA. So I'll jump into that one.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, so have we had conversations with the MPA in Singapore? The answer is yes. In fact, we've had a lot of discussions with a lot of flag states. And what we have been told and what we've actually seen is that the flag states support this method. The flag states actually were at IMO when all the discussions were being made to make those amendments to those different circulars and the convention itself. But what they need is they need somebody in the country, a training provider in the country, say this is how we would like to train. And at that point, then they can mobilize to do approvals. But so far, I think our record is getting approval in 1 hour because the host flag state country was very enthusiastic around simulation. They were just, like I said, waiting for a training provider to get to jump to the plate. And really where that comes in is that the training providers need a strong signal from their customers that they would prefer to be trained using a simulator. That has definitely happened in the offshore oil and gas side. The shipping side is lagging behind a little bit, but they are definitely on the same path as oil and gas.
Great. Thank you, Tony. Okay, and I think Sandeep said thank you for that. So, okay, so we are just, we're almost at 1:15 our time. So I want to thank everyone for joining us, for being patient during just a slight technical difficulty there. And we hope that you join us next week as Robert takes us through the hardware that we use for our simulators, whether it's desktop, full mission, or full mission with motion. The following week, actually, we will be hosted. I will host a webinar with our CTO, Randy Billard. He's going to talk about human factors and learning. And then the following one, the fourth one, we'll do a case study on how a company has implemented simulation into their maritime training. So please keep an eye out for those. Again, thank you very much for attending, and we will see you.